It was the dawn of the 20th century, an age of elegance, invention, and empires. The world seemed to be standing on the edge of modernity. Steamships crossed oceans, telegrams carried words faster than wind, and the glittering capitals of Europe, London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, were alive with art, music, and ambition. Humanity had never felt more confident in its progress. The air was thick with optimism and arrogance. No one knew that beneath this polished calm, history's deadliest storm was gathering strength. The Great War, as it would soon be called, did not begin with armies or declarations. It began with a single spark. On June 28, 1914, in the quiet city of Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie rode through cheering crowds in an open car. But among those crowds stood a young man with a pistol, a nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Two shots shattered the morning air, and within seconds, the fate of millions had changed. The Archduke was dead. The Empire wanted vengeance. What followed was not just retaliation, it was a chain reaction. Europe was divided by a web of alliances so tight that when one nation moved, the others followed. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and declared war. Russia, bound by Slavic ties to Serbia, began to mobilize. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's movement as a threat. France, Russia's ally, entered the frame. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium to reach France, Britain declared war in defense of Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, the world's major powers were locked in conflict. What had started as an assassination now engulfed continents. By August 1914, soldiers marched under banners of pride, believing the war would be over by Christmas. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, soon froze into a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. Trench warfare, grim, suffocating, relentless, defined the conflict. Men lived underground, surrounded by rats and corpses as shells exploded day and night. The Battle of the Somme, Verdun, Ypres, names that still echo with horror, turned fields into graveyards. Over 1 million soldiers died in a single year for a few miles of blood-soaked land. In the east, vast armies clashed across the plains of Poland and Galicia. The Russian forces, poorly supplied and led, suffered devastating losses against the disciplined German and Austro-Hungarian troops. Yet the Eastern Front remained fluid, a war of movement compared to the stagnation in the West. Farther south, in 1915, a bold plan emerged, the Gallipoli campaign. Allied forces, led by Britain and France, aimed to seize control of the Dardanelles Strait and open a route to Russia. Young soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, landed on steep Turkish shores under a hail of bullets. The campaign turned into a nightmare. The heat, disease, and unyielding Ottoman defense crushed the Allied hopes. After months of slaughter, the troops withdrew. Gallipoli became a symbol of bravery and futility. As the war dragged on, it devoured entire nations. The industrial age gave birth to industrialized killing. Machine guns, tanks, poison gas, and aircraft changed warfare forever. The world had never seen destruction on such a scale. Civilians were not spared either. Cities faced food shortages, blockades strangled economies, and millions were displaced from their homes. Then came 1917, a year of chaos and transformation. In Russia, after years of staggering losses and famine, revolution erupted. The Tsar was overthrown, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. The new Soviet government signed a peace treaty with Germany, withdrawing from the war. On the other side of the Atlantic, a different giant was awakening. For 3 years, the United States had remained neutral, watching the old world tear itself apart. But when German submarines began sinking civilian ships, most notably the Lusitania, and secret German messages tried to provoke Mexico against the US, patience ran out. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany, calling it a fight to make the world safe for democracy. American troops crossed the ocean, bringing fresh strength and hope to the weary Allies. By 1918, Germany launched one final desperate offensive on the Western Front. The attack was massive, pushing deep into Allied lines, but the tide soon turned. With American reinforcements and new strategies, the Allies counterattacked. Town after town was liberated, and German morale began to crumble. Inside Germany, hunger and revolution spread like wildfire. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed. 4 years of bloodshed were over. But peace did not come easily. Europe was in ruins. Empires that had stood for centuries collapsed almost overnight. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into smaller nations. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, dissolved. Russia transformed into the Soviet Union. The German Kaiser fled into exile. From the ashes of the old order, new countries emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, and more. Borders were redrawn, but wounds ran deep. In 1919, leaders of the victorious nations gathered in Paris to shape the future. The Treaty of Versailles sought to punish Germany, forcing it to accept full blame for the war and to pay enormous reparations. Its military was dismantled, its economy crippled, and its pride shattered. While the treaty aimed to secure peace, it sowed seeds of resentment that would grow into an even greater catastrophe 2 decades later, World War II. The human cost of the Great War was almost unimaginable. Over 16 million people died, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire generations were lost, villages were emptied, families broken. The trauma of trench warfare gave rise to a new term: shell shock, what we now call PTSD. Soldiers returned home haunted by what they had seen, unable to explain it to those who hadn't. The world's faith in progress was shaken. Yet amid the devastation, change began to take root. The war forced nations to rethink society itself. Women who had stepped into factories, hospitals, and offices while men fought at the front proved their strength and independence. When the war ended, many refused to return to the shadows. The fight for women's suffrage gained momentum, and a new social order began to form. Technology advanced at a terrifying pace. Aviation, medicine, radio communication, and mechanized transport, each accelerated by the needs of war, reshaped the modern world. Blood transfusions became common practice. Plastic surgery, developed to heal the wounded, saved countless lives. The war had opened doors to both destruction and discovery, but peace remained fragile. Economies collapsed under the weight of debt. Veterans struggled to find work. Across Europe, bitterness brewed, especially in Germany, where humiliation and hardship created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. The Great War had promised to end all wars, but instead, it left behind a generation searching for meaning in the chaos. Still, not all its legacies were dark. The League of Nations, though flawed, was humanity's first attempt at global cooperation, a precursor to the United Nations. New nations found their voice, and democracy spread to corners of Europe that had never known it before. In the arts, literature, and philosophy, the war gave rise to a new realism, a brutal honesty about life, death, and the human spirit. Looking back, the Great War stands as both a tragedy and a teacher. It united people in shared suffering and pushed humanity toward progress in medicine, women's rights, and technology. It redefined borders, inspired independence movements, and changed the very way nations saw themselves. But it also left behind a world scarred, millions dead, economies shattered, and the psychological wounds of soldiers and civilians that would take generations to heal. The Treaty of Versailles, instead of reconciliation, planted the seeds of revenge that would grow into another global nightmare. As the decades passed, memorials rose across Europe, endless rows of white crosses marking where the young had fallen. Their silence speaks louder than any speech ever could. Each name carved in stone reminds us that progress without peace is a fragile illusion. The world that entered 1914 was innocent in its confidence. The world that emerged in 1918 was older, wiser, and infinitely sadder. Humanity had glimpsed its own capacity for destruction and for endurance. And so, as we look back more than a century later, we realize that World War I was not just a war of nations. It was a war of humanity against itself. The roar of the cannons may have faded, but the lessons still echo. How pride can blind, how alliances can trap, and how even the smallest spark can ignite the world. The Great War changed everything. Empires, societies, technology, even the way we think about life and death. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is the reminder that peace is not a gift. It is a choice, one that must be made again and again. Because after the calm came the storm, and when the storm passed, the world was never the same again.